In this video, I'll tell you about something I haven't done in a long time. Paint an army, and I'm ready to do it again. I'm generally kind of a skirmish guy, right? Like when I got into Warhammer 40K way back in 5th edition, I got in by mainly playing combat patrol games with my friends. Back then, Combat Patrol was very different from the Combat Patrol that's available today. Back then, the most models that you might end up with in your Combat Patrol force was maybe like 15 troops if they were pretty cheap, and a dedicated transport. It took me a while to actually get a full army built and painted. But eventually I did. My Chaos Space Marine army with a mixture of Black Legion, Plague Marines, and Khorne Berserkers. Back then I really loved soup. But for a pretty long time now, I've been a skirmish player instead of an army player. Partially because I find the rules more enjoyable, and skirmish games give me what I need for kind of like emerging narrative in my head and stuff like that as well. But the biggest thing for me, my group of skirmish soldiers is usually between maybe 3 to 12 miniatures tops, right? Like that's it. Building and painting a warband for a skirmish game is pretty easy to accomplish, much easier than building and painting an army, at least in my mind. Because of this, I've almost exclusively stuck to skirmish games for over a decade now. So back in like May, I think, the folks at One Page Rules sent me a prototype box of an upcoming product. Now, you might be asking, don't they make 100% downloadable rule sets and STL files for 3D printing miniatures? Like, what's in the box? Well, yes, they do. However, they're currently working to get into more kind of physical products and eventually even getting those products into stores, I think. So, like I said, they sent me a prototype box for a new product they were working on that would be something all-inclusive. Models, terrain, tokens, dice, everything. The box is called Broken Truth for Grimdark Future, their sci-fi army game, and it's the Robot Legions versus the Saurian Star Host, aka Space Lizards, aka Splizzards. The robots look kind of actually more like General Grievous from Star Wars than they do like Necrons, I think, personally. And the Star Host look like, well, I mean, they look like Space Lizards, Splizzards. Cool sculpts all around, honestly. I really enjoy them. And also a mix of troops and kind of bigger kind of monster units, right? Like there's technically no vehicles. I don't think. I mean, one of those big robots could be a vehicle, but not really. The terrain is like full color printed on like super thick, cardstock. It comes with a paper playmat that's about 3 by 4 feet, and it also has dice and tokens and all kinds of stuff like that. Now, like I said, they sent it to me back in May. However, like they didn't pay me or anything like that, just like the box and the models to check out and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty much like, hey, take a look at this and, make a video if you're interested or whatever. From what I understand, the set will be going on, into crowdfunding up on GameFound very soon. I'll put a link down in the description below if you want to go look at it and follow it or whatever. It's not any kind of affiliate link or anything like that. I'm just pretty impressed by a 2-player starter box that actually gives you 2 1,000-point armies, terrain, mat, dice, tokens, etc., all that stuff, and will sell for $180 during the crowdfunding period. In this economy? But honestly, it's like a little bit more than just that. I'll be honest, the box kind of sat for a while after I received it, right? Now, Ash, over at Guerrilla Miniature Games, he made a video about it pretty much ASAP. Pachow. So check that out if you want, something a little bit more in depth. But like I said, I'm not really an army game player, so the idea of it didn't really get me too excited. Eventually, I did open the box and start going through the contents just to kind of see what was in there. And I discovered something kind of interesting, something I didn't expect. Most of the models, except for the biggest ones, were already all assembled. And that made a really big difference to me. Now, I mentioned that this was a prototype box that I was sent. What that meant mainly was that nearly all of the models in the box were 3D printed, so I could see the sculpts and like paint them and all that kind of stuff if I wanted to do that kind of thing. However, the box that'll be shipped to people and eventually end up, I think, in stores, after this whole crowdfund, this thing won't be 3D printed. Those models won't be. The models will instead be in an actual form of plastic, but not the normal kind of plastic that companies like Games Workshop use, right? Which is, I think, called HIPS, high impact polystyrene. This plastic is a different kind of material that they've been referring to as hard PVC. And the biggest benefit to that is that the models show up pre-built. Not all of the models in this prototype box that I got are 3D printed. 13 of the Splizzards models in the set are made up of the final production material, the hard PVC. And they're really great detail. And the smaller units, like the Saurian Warriors in this case, are already attached to bases. They have integrated, round bases at the right size and that whole deal. The 3 bigger lizard guys with the shoulder pad rocket launchers or whatever, like they aren't on bases, but the bases are going to be included in the box, I'm pretty sure. Like they were in the prototype box, so I assume that they would later on with the actual real production box. What this all means is that you can then just glue those big guys to bases or whatever, and the little guys are already on bases, and then prime them, and then start painting right away. For me, this was actually pretty big. See, when I heard that OPR was moving into plastics, I assumed right away that they'd be on like sprues, like Games Workshop models, or maybe the pieces would be in those little individual baggies and you'd have to put them together like the original Star Wars Legion models or older Mantic models or stuff like that. But when I saw that they were already built and ready to prime, my interest level increased. Building and painting an army, even a smaller army of like 40-ish models, was daunting and I wasn't too enthused. But skipping most of the building and going right to painting? That sounded pretty great. I've never really self-identified as a builder or a painter, right? I usually enjoy both pretty equally. However, when I realized that I wasn't going to have to build these models, except for like a few of the kind of bigger creatures or whatever, but to make an army, I became much more interested in tackling the project. I decided to start with the robot legions, which were 100% 3D printed in the case of my particular prototype box. I glued them to bases, textured the bases. I like to texture my bases before I prime models, pachow, and then I started priming them black with my airbrush. I knew I was going to keep their bodies like metallic, right? Like hence the black primer. But the color scheme I'd come up with for them required some additional airbrush work on the capes worn by pretty much all of the troops, right? They pretty much all have capes. I had decided on Army Painter True Brass, dry brushed over black primer for their bodies, and then like a teal color for their cloaks, and then bright orange for accent paints, like power glows and stuff like that on the weapons and all that kind of jazz. So after priming, then I used the airbrush to paint the cloaks using the Army Painter Air paint color. It's a Ruinous Spell and Wizard's Orb as the highlight. Then it was non-airbrush time. Regular brush time? Just brush time? Anyway, these parts I mostly did on Twitch, where I usually stream 2 times per week, Monday nights and Friday mornings, Central Time Zone. Give a follow and get reminded the next time I go online. There's a link down in the description below. The airbrush paint had, of course, gotten onto parts that I didn't want it on, like the parts that weren't cape, right? Like the shoulder pads and the hunchback and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted those to stay metallic. So I colored those areas black again pretty quickly with some Army Painter Speed Paint Grim Black, a very fluid yet very pretty opaque black color. Once the metal on the models was back to black, then it was time to dry brush the metal parts. Once that was done, then it was time to figure out where the orange accent highlights would be on, all the different models. Generally, it was like power sources and kind of like lighting and things like that. the hoses that connect to the guns on the warriors, stuff like that. And I liked the look, right? With the caped troops, the color scheme was mostly 60% teals, 30% dry brushed true brass, and about 10% of the bright oranges. With the bigger creatures, who had a lot more metal and weren't wearing capes, those values usually flipped a bit to about 60% true brass and 30%-ish about teals, and then 10% again of the bright oranges. However, the overall army looks very coherent when they're all together, and that was really the important part for me. I'm not going step by step here, mostly because I didn't really film much of it while I was doing it, other than streaming it on Twitch, I guess. And because that's not really what this video is about. This video is about thinking I wasn't interested in army games at all, when actually it was that I just wasn't interested in building and painting an army's worth of troops and the extra stuff, right? Since these troops were already built, in this case because they were 3D printed, and in the future because they'll be pre-assembled hard PVC, it made the hobby portion of the army much more enjoyable to me. But it's not just the hobby part that makes me interested. It's the Grimdark Future rules as well. The rules are streamlined in a way I really enjoy. I've already been playing Grimdark Future Firefight, their skirmish rules, for some time now, and the army rules have a lot of similarities, right? Also, like with skirmish rules, the army rules have a clear base kind of set of rules, like core rules, and you can start playing those, and then you can kind of modularly add on tons of other rules that are in the back of the book as you kind of go and as you want to. Just use the ones that you like and ignore the ones you don't. It's actually a really great rule set. Also, the online army builder called Army Forge is pretty much the best in the business, in my opinion. And I've mentioned this before here and on live streams and stuff like that. Army Forge really allows me to build and add to armies very, very quickly. And the army sheet that it kicks out when you're done, right, shows you nearly everything that you need to play. You don't have to constantly go back into the rules to remember what that one special rule does, or another or whatever like that. They're listed all right there on the sheet. All the special rules that your force has, they're put there on the sheet so you don't have to go back and look. And though these are really like only 1,000-point, armies in this box, the game is designed to work really well at games of that smaller size, unlike some games which don't. And now that my Robot Legion force is completed, I've already started working on the Splizzards. They're going to have mostly purple skin and mostly gold metal parts, using my favorite gold glittering loot metallic speed paint from the Army Painter. I'm honestly not sure what my accent color or colors might be yet, right? Like, you don't always need to have 3 main colors for your army, but it's the way that I generally kind of prefer it, so we'll see how it goes. I also have a 1,000-point list for Grimdark Future using the Human Defense Force list, right? And that will be for my already painted Imperial Guard Combat Patrol, so it kind of comes full circle. So even though I'm generally not an army game enjoyer these days, as it turns out, I can be persuaded by models I like that are not too numerous and don't have to be built, and for the game rules that aren't too dense and overblown. Are you a skirmish fan that might be convinced by just the right army game? Or are you totally anti-army game? Let us all know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, if you liked the video and want to see more one-page rules content, then engage in some depressmentation of the like button. It really does help the channel, and I appreciate it. If you want to see videos like this every single Friday, while you're down there, also hit the sub button. The subscribe button down there says subscribe on it. It's free. Thanks for watching.